All right, so just wanted to take a few minutes to give some feedback on the formative assessment assignment. One thing I want to point out, I've had a lot of people in the last couple of weeks, particularly requesting to resubmit assignments. Guys, I'm not trying to be a jerk, not trying to be mean, but there literally just isn't time for that. There may come to be a time as the course draws down that I may offer up the ability to edit and resubmit a single assignment. That's a possibility, given on how we finish the term and how the times fall. That's a possibility. However, I want to explain to you that, we cover 20 chapters of information that's necessary within 7 weeks. This assignment alone, because everyone had 3 activities, was a submission of over 100 items that had to be scored. So in order for me to give you timely feedback, the number of times I can allow submissions is just limited, as there are a limited number of hours in the day. But I want to kind of help you see how, if you're really, really using your resources, multiple submissions really should not be necessary, okay? Most of the time when I'm deducting points for something, it's not because someone has attempted to do that and has done it incorrectly. Many, many, many times it's because that item is missing entirely. So I want you to take a minute and kind of follow along with me here. What you're looking at is the rubric and the instructions for this assignment that I had posted in that week 3. And I gave just brief instructions. Of course, it also came with a video that you should have watched. So we're going to watch the video when we get an assignment. Then we're going to look at the instructions. We're going to look at the rubric. When we finally think we're finished and we're ready to submit, we're going to look at that rubric and we're going to look for each one of those items in our own assignments before we hit submit. Okay. Now, what that means is it's best if you don't wait till the very last minute to do this, because when you're in a rush, you're just more likely to accidentally leave things out. You're also more likely to hurry up and submit before you actually do last minute checking. So if you're one of those people you're getting dinged with points because you're leaving out things, you need to slow down, okay? And you need to make sure you're checking that rubric. A resubmission should not be granted just to remind somebody to do what's already in the instructions, okay? So you have that there. If you're really self-assessing and you're thinking about the assignments, you have the ability to check that before you turn it in, and you definitely should do so. All right, so what specific feedback can I give about this assignment? First of all, I want to point out that every time I make a comment on your assignment does not necessarily mean that I deducted points for that. The only way I'm going to deduct points is if there's something I see there that's either in contrast with what I've asked you to produce, or something that you have applied incorrectly or left out. Sometimes I just give you feedback on what can make your task better. It's not necessarily that it's bad the way it is, but that it would help you out as a teacher more, or it would be more effective for your students, or it would really deepen the understanding if you did such things. So always read through those. If you see a minus next to it, a subtraction, then I have taken away points for something. Usually it's pretty easy to see where it applies to one of these indicators on the rubric. All right, so first and foremost, you had to have complete items. That includes all of these things listed above, okay? Type of assessment, your learning target, your level of blooms, the Kentucky Academic Standard, a copy of what you're going to give to the students, a mini rubric. Okay, if I can't understand what you're asking the student to do, if I don't have the complete picture, then it's impossible for me to evaluate this. Please understand that. All right, so we had to have 3 complete formative assessment items. The biggest place where I saw an issue with that was either leaving out your grading rubric or leaving out the description of what you were going to count as mastery here. So that's very important. That rubric also would have come back to play a part here in this category, which we'll get to in a minute. Okay. Number 1 issue would have been this portion or this portion. It is split pretty much down the middle. The problem is, you'll notice those are also the 2 biggest point gathering indicators here. So your items adequately assess your standards and your learning targets. First of all, if you're not using the right standards, then you're automatically sort of dead in the water here, okay? We've had video up on video that talks about how Kentucky does not use Common Core standards anymore. They were the first state to adopt Common Core, but they got rid of it and introduced new, quotation marks, new standards in 2019. If you dig really deep into the standards, what you will notice is that a lot of them are exactly the same as what the Common Core standards were. However, they are not coded always exactly the same way. Now, what does that mean? The coding is all of those numbers and letters at the beginning of the standard. Okay. So I've worked with standards quite a bit, old ones and the new ones, and several sets before that. As much as I've worked with them, most of them I can recognize as which ones are which, especially if they're the different ones. If I'm not sure, I do always take the time and Google it and search it to find out. So please make sure that you are using Kentucky academic standards, not Common Core standards. Yes, sometimes they are the same. No, they're not. Let me explain to you how serious this is. When a district hires you, the number one obligation that you have as a special ed teacher, of course, is to follow special ed law in terms of IEPs and students' individual needs. But a close second to that is your legal liability to make sure that you are teaching students the proper standards for their age and their grade level, given where they are. Now, understand this. If you were to document somewhere, somehow, that you were teaching a student a standard that was not part of the adopted standards, if you're using the wrong set of standards to teach, that is something that can come back to cause you some liability issues. So please understand this for the large deal it is. You need to make sure you're looking at the right standards. You also need to understand that the standards for content and the standards for math practice are not the same thing. Again, I've sent multiple videos about that. The content standards are what we need them to learn. The standards for practice are the things we should be doing in our classroom every single day to help them master those standards as effectively as they possibly can. Okay. So if you're still not clear about that, you need to come to a Zoom session or you need to contact me through email and see if I can help you work through it. I'm going to increase the penalties for using the wrong set of standards because at this point in the game, really everybody should have been able to move past that. All right, so standards, really important. You also need to make sure that no matter what standard you put down there, that whatever you're asking them to do matches that standard. If your standard says that you want them to evaluate a conclusion, okay, let's say I want my students to evaluate the conclusion drawn in the math problem presented. And then all I ask them to do is actually do a calculation. Even though that calculation might match, somehow might have something to do with that standard, if they're not actually evaluating, critiquing, giving some feedback on something, if all they're doing is doing a calculation, then your standard and your activity don't match. And that is completely contrary to the purpose of the formative assessment. Your formative assessment is there to let you know, are students able to do and understand what I have taught? And either that, if the activity doesn't match your standard, then that either means it's been a mistake and you've chosen the wrong activity, or what you're teaching is not necessarily matching the standard either. And that's another conversation to have. So please, please, please be very aware of that. I have a lot of people who ask, what's the difference between a target and a standard? Aren't they the same thing? When you're in very early elementary, that's entirely possible because the standards are pretty straightforward. If I'm a kindergartner and I want to count from 1 to 100, then my learning target, I can count from 1 to 100. That's pretty straightforward. However, as students get older and you get into more advanced math, there may be different layers. For example, when I taught AP statistics, the exam, one of their standards was that students could draw a conclusion based on a hypothesis test. If you know anything about that, you know that that's a multi-layered process. They have to write a hypothesis. They have to gather data. They have to perform statistical tests on the data. They have to come to a conclusion based on the data that they see. So my targets for each day might take on those individual parts of that overall standard. It's possible to cover, multiple learning targets within one standard. So keep that in mind. They can be the same. That's certainly possible. They don't always have to be. Avoid using things like understand in your learning target. I talked about that in the video. Reason being, that's a nightmare to try to evaluate. Okay. You want to be as specific as you can in these learning targets. I can evaluate, I can model, I can, whatever specifically it is you want to see them do, that needs to be there in the target. Okay. So, identifying levels of blooms, that was a little bit of an issue for some of you, and that's not necessarily your fault. That has to do more with the nature of math problems and the way they're written. Math problems, we often see the words evaluate and create. And that's not necessarily the same action that's being implied when we see the levels of evaluate and create in Bloom's taxonomy. Okay, for example, evaluate, the level of evaluate in Bloom's, that is taking the perspective that we are critiquing something. We are showing its good parts and its bad parts. When we evaluate a math expression, that's not exactly the same. Okay, so math problems can be a little bit tricky in terms of setting up those Bloom's verbs. So don't just look at the words, actually read the understanding of what is going on in those Bloom's categories, and then see if that matches what you're asking students to do. Okay, that's a better way to pick that out. All right, so the last item, between the standards and this rubric issue, that was where we saw the most challenge, especially with the rubric. The rubric is not just there to give student a grade, although that is certainly a big part of it. We want them to understand these are the correct items that you've done. This is what you need to work on. But it's not just there to give a grade. In fact, if you take a formative assessment item and you put an accuracy grade on it and record that grade, you've no longer got a formative assessment. You have a summative assessment. Okay. We do want to count accuracy. That is important. But we also want to have a statement somewhere in there that tells us what level of accuracy lets me know they really understand this. Okay. And it should be a fairly high level of accuracy. If you have 5 problems or 5 prompts that you want them to solve or work with, I would set my level at 4 or 5. Once you get down to 3, you're getting down to barely more than half. And if you have multiple choice items, well, that's a possibility they could guess. Okay, so you want to decide what your standard for mastery is going to be beforehand. Reason being, we're always wanting to reteach. We're always wanting to address misconceptions. If you don't know that students are having them, you can't effectively do that. And sometimes just walking around and watching is just not enough. Some students are not going to participate with you. Some students are going to effectively hide that they are confused. They're ashamed of it. They don't want you to know. So by looking at these items, that is your evidence of what they know and what they don't know. Nothing wrong with putting a self-assessment task in here. I would strongly suggest, though, that you always put it with an actual prompt or example. Just like in the video when I talked about doing a thumbs up or a thumbs down, that would usually take place in a classroom where maybe students are working problems on whiteboards, or they're doing something along that matter. Not only can they see what they're doing, but also to some degree, I can. Okay. Now, in whole class formative assessments, obviously, unless you have a really small class, you're not going to be able to get into a lot of detail of who got how many right and who got how many wrong. That's why we also, in addition to whole class formatives, we also want to do individual formatives. Okay, whole class kind of like gets the big picture, and then the individual formatives lets us go in and work through the details exactly. Okay, that's absolutely necessary, and it's good for students. It's also required in today's classrooms. Okay, so your rubric, it had to be there. It had to reflect on accuracy. Okay, because if all we want them to do is think about it, then the standard would not say they needed to do it. Okay, it needs to be an accuracy reflection, not because we're going to give them a grade, but because we need to understand where they've gone wrong so we can help them get back on the right path. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. If there's anything that you're confused about in terms of this assignment, please let me know. If I were to decide that we could have some resubmissions, that's something I would send out later on, okay, in a weekly overview or something of that nature. In the meantime, okay, I've also gotten, what can I do to bring up my grades? Some big things. First of all, when a bonus assignment is posted, please do it. Bonus assignments will not always be allowed to be turned in as late, so please keep that in mind. In addition to that, make sure you turn your stuff in on time. because there is a penalty, a 10% penalty that comes from late submissions. And if you have questions, you don't understand how something works, you need to ask those questions before you submit the assignment. Okay, that's why we have a Zoom meeting. That's why I'm available by email. You're always welcome to ask me to take a look at something. I've done that for several of you. I've given you feedback on it. I'm not going to grade it for you before you submit it, but I will give you some advice and some feedback on how to streamline it and make it the best that it can possibly be. Okay, so if you have questions, let me know, and I will see you in a moment for week 4.